So welcome. I am Claire Hopkinson. I'm the Director and CEO of the Toronto Arts Council and the Toronto Arts Foundation. Why, thank you very much. I wasn't expecting that, but I'll just say that we have a very full room, as you can tell, and it's so exciting. If anybody needs a seat, there are some seats around the side of the room, or one of the team will help you. We would like everybody to be seated at their tables for the discussions later on. So it's really terrific to see you here today to participate in this important discussion, reshaping how we understand the value of arts and culture. You know, it's clear there's a great deal of interest in discussing how the UK's Arts and Humanity Research Council's Cultural Value Project is relevant here and now in Toronto and in Canada. And you know, we don't have enough opportunities here in Toronto to get together to talk about issues facing the arts. So, you know, maybe this is the start of something. We shall see. And we have a wide range of arts supporters and creators in this room: national, provincial, local funders, elders, educators, researchers, arts board members who are part of our foundation's Creative Champions Network, representatives of corporate and philanthropy, artists, makers, policymakers, cultural leaders, including great participation from TAC's Leaders Lab alumni. Yay! Thank you all for joining us. And as we gather here, you know, I want to acknowledge the diversity of the First Peoples of this area. This has been a site of activity for some 15,000 years. That's 15,000 years of artists, storytellers, and communities coming together on this land, the traditional Indigenous territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island and around the world. And we're grateful to have this opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on this territory. This event is co-hosted by Metcalf Foundation, OCADU University, Ontario Trillium Foundation, as well as TAC and Toronto Arts Foundation. And it's been great to work with them. As policymakers and educators, we need rigorous ways of understanding and illustrating the importance of arts and culture. Toronto's not-for-profit art scene is thriving. Our creative industries are booming. And we know in our hearts, and, of course, from studies, that arts and culture are central to the health of our society. But how to measure this? How to express this in ways that the public and corporate Canada and our politicians understand? This is a relevant challenge facing all of us in this room. Now, a little housekeeping. We will keep the momentum going as we move from Professor Crossick's keynote to an exciting panel discussion moderated by David Maggs to the roundtable discussions involving all of you, facilitated by an illustrious group of people, one at each table, so get to know each other, introduce yourselves. We will collect the notes of the discussions from each tables, and we're going to do something with them. And we're also going to be sending out a post-event survey, so please take the time to respond. This means that there are no formal breaks, but there are washrooms that way, and there's tea and coffee and refreshments to keep you fueled until we break for wine and nibbles at 6 or 6:15. I'd like to thank the Globe and Mail Centre for helping sponsor this event, and to Business and Arts, not only for their very helpful financial contribution, but also for presenting Professor Geoffrey Crossick at the 2018 Canadian Arts Summit at the Banff Centre. Sarah Diamond, Liz Forsberg, Sandy Houston, and I were so inspired by what he had to say that it was literally, as we sat in the back of the bus going back to the airport, we said, we have to bring him back to Toronto. And we have. And so I'd like to ask one of our co-conspirators, Sandy Houston, President and CEO of the Metcalf Foundation, to the stage for a moment.
Thank you, Claire, and I will only be a moment. I just want to say that we are so pleased at Metcalf to be co-hosting this week of activities with our partners and collaborators, the Toronto Arts Council and Foundation, Trillium, and OCADU University. In all the funding streams at Metcalf, and we have three, we work in the performing arts, the environment, and in poverty reduction. We try to work with organizations to support the development of dynamic leadership, the emergence of new ideas, and to try and foster integrated thinking. So when the opportunity came to bring Professor Geoffrey Crossick back, as Claire said, it really emerged in the back of the bus almost the moment we left Banff. His seminal research on the value of the arts is a comprehensive response to a long-standing question, and I think one we all grapple with in aspects of our lives and practice, and one that seems particularly pointed in particular at the moment. It seems to us so important that we find a broad, integrated, and deeply human response to this question of value and why it's so very important. And I also want to just take this opportunity to flag something that has a Canadian lens on this that Metcalf's been working on recently with a partner called The Philanthropist, which is a small online magazine here in Canada. And they asked us a number of months ago to curate a series of articles about the performing arts and culture and philanthropy in Canada. And essentially, it was an opportunity for us to provide a set of perspectives on this. So we commissioned 6 articles for this online magazine. And the 4th one just emerged last week. And it's actually not an article. It's a series of 3 videos from 3 Toronto performing arts companies talking about the interrelationship of philanthropy and their art-making process. It also picks up questions like the value of the arts, how the funding system is working right now, how 5 individual Canadian artists think about the impact of their art making, and also identifies some of the key emerging issues. There'll be a couple more elements to this series emerging this month, one from Kate Taylor, who's the well-known cultural journalist with the Globe and Mail, and it will wrap up with a piece from my colleague Michael Trent, who directs the Performing Arts program at Metcalf at the end of October. So I just want to flag this and encourage this crew who is clearly interested in this topic to have a look at what some Canadians are thinking about our own practice. I hope you have a great afternoon today and encourage the conversation with your colleagues on this important topic. Thank you.
So, that's okay. Do take a seat, and then I'm going to introduce you with glowing... No. Yes, so we don't see you blushing yet. Well, I wanted to first say thank you very much, Sandy, for participating in this, and I'm really enjoying that series done by the Philanthropist. But now it is my great, great pleasure to introduce Professor Geoffrey Crossick. It's also daunting to introduce him, as his contributions are numerous and impressive. He is a distinguished professor of the humanities at the School of Advanced Study in London, the director of the AHRC Cultural Value Project, and of course, its major report, which we're speaking about. He is a historian, an arts enthusiast, a policy buff, a researcher, the chair of the Crafts Council, a member of the boards of the Horniman Museum, Guildhall School of Music and Drama, and the National Film and Television School. He has literally been crisscrossing the globe since he co-authored the Cultural Value Report. And I'm really, really grateful that he could find the time to come to speak with us here today. Please join me now. Thank you for the warm-up.
Thank you, Claire, and apologies for getting up too soon. But and thank you all for coming. And I do hope that you don't, towards the end of my talk, wonder whether they wouldn't have been better using their time drinking beer in the back of the bus rather than plotting for me to come. I very much hope not. Let me start with 2 words of thanks. First of all, to you all for coming to hear what I have to say and to join the discussion. It really is a dauntingly large and impressive audience that has assembled here. And secondly, to the organisations who've invited me after the Canadian Arts Summit in Banff last year. I was really honoured by the invitation and look forward very much to contributing to what I know is a live issue in Toronto and in Canada more broadly. The issue is how we understand the value of arts and culture and how we shape the case we make to others and also to ourselves about the impact they have. There are too many off-the-peg frameworks being developed in this field, and my aim is not to offer another one of those to you. My hope, rather, is that the way my Cultural Value Project approach these questions will connect with your own reflections and enrich the conversation. The value of arts and culture has been argued over since ancient Greece, but in the last 25 years, it's their benefit to the economy above all that has come to dominate discussion in Britain, my own country, and in many other Western countries. Advocates point to tourism, they point to the employment and expenditure by cultural venues, and then they use standard economic multipliers to estimate the effect of all of these on the wider economy. There's been much dissatisfaction, not only with the weaknesses of economic impact methods, and there's a lot of weakness in those methodologies, but also with its narrowness as an indicator of the value of arts and culture. Nonetheless, claims about economic impact continue to be made by the sector, and they led Robert Peston, at that time the BBC's economics editor, to ask at an event that I attended, he asked, if we could prove conclusively that the economic impact of the arts was zero, would we stop children from learning to draw? And much unfolds from that pertinent question. Various attempts have been made to broaden what is captured by economic approaches, but however much the methods are refined, a basic question remains. How can we expect simple measures, whether about the economy or any other area, to capture the value of something as complex as the experience of arts and culture? Cultural value is not an absolute where the challenge is to find the right way to measure it. It's a dynamic construct which changes over time as discourses, including policy discourses, change. And that was the context in which the UK's Arts and Humanities Research Council asked me to lead its new Cultural Value Project a few years ago. This was set up to identify the value of arts and culture to individuals and to society, recognizing that the social benefit was not simply an aggregation of the individual benefits, and to consider, importantly, how we obtain evidence about that value. We drew on an extensive research literature, as well as the results of 70 small pieces of research, and it culminated in a 200-page report written by myself and Patrycja Kaczynska, the excellent project researcher. The report sought to help reshape the debate about the value and impact of culture, to question claims that couldn't be supported by adequate evidence, and to highlight neglected ways of thinking about the issue. We wanted to allow what I kept calling more grown-up conversations, where we didn't always insist on the benefit of the arts, where we even acknowledged that they might have damaging consequences, and above all, where we only made claims for which we could provide evidence, albeit evidence drawn from a much wider range of methods than normal. In my view, 4 fundamental questions must be asked about any discussion of the value of arts and culture, and my talk will be structured around them. First, who wants to know and why? Second, what's the phenomenon whose value we're trying to understand? Third, are we looking in the right places in our search for value? And fourth, by what methods should we find and evidence that value? These are 4 very big questions, and in the time available, I can do no more than sketch the importance of each of them, but I hope they'll generate discussion afterwards. But before doing so, let me highlight a key theme of the report: personal experience. This has generally been far too neglected, certainly in Britain, as a source of the value and impact of culture. What happens when we visit a museum, watch a play, read a novel, join a community arts event, make a quilt, see an exhibition, play a video game, or whatever? The report argues that personal experience is at the root of much cultural value. Experience as an individual or as part of a group, and that its neglect has had serious consequences for our understanding of the difference that arts and culture makes. Personal experience matters because value does not reside in an artifact, a performance, or an event, but in the process by which an artifact, a performance, or an event is engaged with by people, audiences, communities. It's to be found in processes, not in objects. And personal experience will be a recurrent theme of what I have to say in this talk. So let me now return to my 4 questions. And first, who wants to know and why? This matters because all questions derive from a context. In many countries, value is identified to serve public funding, to secure public funding for the arts. Those making the case in Britain do so in terms they believe governments want to hear, which mostly means talking about the economy. But the new Labour government from 1997 onwards added other objectives, not just the impact of arts and culture on the economy, but also their benefits for urban regeneration, social inclusion, community cohesion, and health. In other words, increased public funding for culture in return for being closely tied into government social objectives, with new public management approaches monitoring the results. It provoked the wonderful response by Britain's best-known ceramicist, Grayson Perry. This pot will reduce crime by 29%. A wonderful example of how art can do in one moment what academic papers take pages and pages to do. The case for the arts was mostly about objectives that could be achieved by other means, and rarely compared outcomes with other ways of achieving them. My impression is that some dimensions of this may be appearing at the federal level, at least, in Canada today, with both its positive and its problematic aspects. During the new Labour years in Britain, an alternative approach that begins with what arts and culture can irreducibly do was rarely taken. The cultural sector vacated the territory where such an argument could be built. Instead, it has since then made the case for public funding in terms governments want to hear, with bold claims and quantitative evidence. Is this the distinction between intrinsic and instrumental approaches to the value of the arts, as some see it? I find this a problematic distinction, with the intrinsic tending to be equated with art for art's sake, resisting questions about what difference the arts make. If we believe that arts and culture make a difference to people and to society, then we must say that, and not retreat into what is often the defensiveness of the intrinsic. Instead, we should emphasize those outcomes and impacts that the arts can uniquely, or at least specially, achieve, and to do so while open to the full range of individual, societal, and economic outcomes. But there's more than one reason to collect and analyze evidence about the difference that engaging with arts and culture makes. There is research, carried out mostly by academics, better to understand the phenomenon. There's evaluation, carried out for cultural organisations, generally to present results to funders for accountability. And there is reflective practice, with arts practitioners thinking critically about what they've been doing in order to improve their practice, whatever the objectives of their practice are. The three different categories obviously overlap, even if their objectives differ. Arts practitioners and organisations are the most neglected of these. Surely they should want to know whether their objectives, their artistic and their social objectives, are being met. But evaluation is too often done to meet the accountability requirements of funders. If arts and cultural practitioners are to take rigorous evaluation seriously, then the benefit to themselves must be more real. And there's another reason for being cautious about prioritising the advocacy objectives of capturing the value of arts and culture. When funding pressures arise, and I know this is a time of uncertainty for cultural funding across Canada as it is in the UK, when funding pressures arise, there is a tendency to become defensive and make the case in ever more narrow ways, second-guessing what politicians want to hear. Instead, the cultural sector should be seeking to shape what politicians and funders ask of it, what they want to hear. Taking control of the narrative is important in tough times, perhaps even more so than in good ones. And so, to my second question, what is the phenomenon whose value we're trying to understand? Are we seeking to capture the value of the right things? This varies greatly, with structures of cultural provision, funding models, and national discourses about arts and culture. The fact that in Britain, the discussion has focused on provisions subsidised by government means that it's about national museums and galleries, theatres, orchestras, dance companies and opera companies, as well as mostly smaller arts organisations funded through Arts Council England, an arm's-length body which makes its own decisions about how to distribute public resources. This focus on government funding, and to funding by different tiers of government, which is particularly important in Canada, means that debate about arts and culture neglects commercially provided culture. It neglects third sector organisations, and it neglects amateur and participatory culture. Yet those together constitute the great majority of people's cultural experience. Enlarging the focus to include these requires us to ask different questions and look in different places for evidence of value. Virtually all literature, film, music, and games are provided commercially. And amateur engagement with art and culture vastly exceeds professional, as ordinary people make textiles or paint in their leisure time, join drama groups and choirs, or make digital content online. We neglect all of these at our peril when we talk about the value of arts and culture. There is, of course, a little-studied ecosystem where these simplistic boundaries between government-funded, commercial, third sector, and amateur turn out to be very permeable. The flows between publicly funded and commercial are the most obvious, with subsidized arts taking risks over content and spending time developing both talent and ideas which later benefit the commercial sector. There are many other such flows of money, people, and ideas within this ecosystem. Research for the Cultural Value Project, for example, uncovered the myriad of interactions between those involved in live music production in different English cities, where a dense web makes notions of commercial, subsidized, and amateur seem entirely irrelevant. They overlap and integrate with each other. Shifting the focus to other forms of cultural provision also makes us ask much more about the digital transformation of cultural experience. The most common commercial cultural products, film, TV series, music, and books, can now all be downloaded or streamed. Video games are increasingly experienced in online and multiplayer environments. If digital access to commercial culture is the most extensive change, the most striking is how co-production of content blurs the distinction between producer and consumer. The convergence of digital platforms, social networks, online niche communities, and consumer-generated creative content is all at an early stage, but its scale is already striking. Seemingly niche communities can be huge in terms of global users, such as the musical composition and sharing site SoundCloud, or Machinima, where users make original films from content derived from video games engines and gameplay recorded in real time. When last I looked, 2 years ago, 6 billion hits had taken place on that site, and I suspect not many people in this room even know about it. And there are doubtless newer such sites of which I'm not aware either. We're seeing major structural shifts in how culture is produced, performed, and experienced. The ability of digital activity to shape people's engagement with culture and how they attach value to it is something we need to understand a great deal better. Enlarging our focus in this way immediately opens to view the diverse locations where people engage with culture. Yes, galleries and museums, concert halls and theatres, but also small-scale spaces such as live music venues, institutions such as care homes and prisons, as well as while travelling, at home, and through the virtual space of the internet. The home, indeed, frames most cultural engagement. In Britain, 94% of all film is watched at home, while the great majority of music is listened to at home or while travelling. The home is where people experience most film, music, television, craft, literature, video games, and where digital online cultural activities are experienced. And virtually all of this is commercial or amateur, and we discuss it very little when we talk about the value of art and culture. Unless we explore the value of all cultural engagement, we can't begin to understand why it's important. And we can then free up the way we make arguments for publicly funded provision. As researchers and as cultural practitioners, we need to understand the difference culture makes in general before we ask the secondary, albeit very important question, why some of it should be funded from public sources. Publicly funded culture will then be seen as embedded in an ecology, where the commercial, publicly funded, and amateur support each other, with public subsidy enabling key parts of that ecology to function. It's often in the publicly funded sector that risks are taken, new ideas emerge, talent is developed, all with the costly time and infrastructure that these need. And here lies a key component of the case for subsidy, the way publicly funded culture is part of a much broader ecology that generates the benefits associated with arts and culture. Enlarging the range of cultural experience also makes us question the deficit model that defines how we discuss cultural participation, certainly in the UK. The deficit model asks who is missing from publicly subsidised provision and talks about something called barriers, but without asking about the cultural activities those people, often from disadvantaged or minority social groups, are actually engaging with. In Britain, a broader focus captures streamed film, music on YouTube, television, crafting at home, singing in a church choir, and much, much else. Inequality with respect to access, resources, and infrastructure are certainly important. I'm not denying that. But we must ask what cultural activity people are involved in. And this means valorizing more than elite and publicly funded culture. I am, of course, aware of a specific dimension of the equity argument in Canada, which relates to the participation and the culture of Indigenous and First Nation groups. But you will know a great deal more about how those issues fit into the wider discourse about social equity than I do. My third question asks whether we look in the right places when we look for value. Giving priority to data on economic and social policy objectives distorts our understanding. And even in conventional areas, such as the economy, cities, and education, it leads us to focus on the wrong things. The report has 6 separate chapters on each of what we call the components of cultural value. 2 of these, which we call the reflective individual and the engaged citizen, are discussed first because they're often neglected. The other 4 components, again with a chapter each, may be more expected. The economy, cities, health, and education. In each of these, we don't start looking for indicators. Can we find data in this area, and can we turn it into a quantitative indicator? No, instead, we start where possible with personal experience of arts and culture, even if we don't stop there. And it's true that personal experience as an individual or in social settings is harder to capture with quantitative indicators, though that doesn't mean that it cannot be done. But personal experience is often a key to understanding. Now, I could deliver a lecture on each of these components of cultural value alone, so what I'm going to say will be very compressed, but will give you a taste of what I think is important and how it might reconfigure our approach to the value and impact of culture, as well as to the methods by which we capture it. Let me start with the reflective individual and the engaged citizen, because they're in many ways the most innovative and will, I hope, resonate with conversations going on here in Toronto. A long chapter explores how arts and culture help shape reflective individuals, facilitating greater understanding of themselves and their lives, increasing empathy with respect to others, and helping an appreciation of the diversity of human experience, cultures, and people. The report draws on research on very diverse topics and includes a case study of the place of arts in the criminal justice system, where a massive initiatives in prisons and elsewhere involve drama, visual arts, dance, embroidery, much else. These have in the UK been subject to extensive evaluations. Have they reduced reoffending? The evidence is not there to show that they have. But how can having been in a drama or art group in prison itself prevent reoffending in the face of challenges after release, such as housing, relationships, and employment? There is powerful evidence, however, that it has begun the journey towards desistance, the process of personal growth through which an offender shifts their identity to being a non-offender. At the heart of desistance, which is now the prevailing orthodoxy in criminology, is an ability to think about oneself and others, to see genuine choices and options, to imagine other possible futures. Art does this. It introduces uncertainty where only certainty seems to exist. It allows ambiguity and silences in a prison environment where they are absent. It introduces options where no options seem available. And there is significant evidence of art's role in shifting offenders' sense of themselves and their relation to others. Now, my interest in art in prisons is not primarily that it constitutes a beneficial social intervention, but because it's a case study of the reflectiveness that can be generated in us all by engagement with the arts. There are many other ways in which such engagement has been shown to stimulate a greater openness and reflection. In Oscar Wilde's parable, The Doer of Good, a figure walks through a city and sees the ambivalent and often detrimental results of his previous good deeds. In a training session for experienced doctors, reading this parallel led them to confront their own assumptions about what it means to try to do good and their attitudes to consent. It led to them discussing a particular scandal in Britain a few years ago, in which it emerged that doctors had been keeping for medical research the organs of babies who had died, but without asking or even telling their parents. These discussions took place in a way that would not have been as open or as thoughtful had the topics been addressed head-on, instead of raised in the context of a particular work of literature. A wider dimension of this reflectiveness is seen in how arts engagement can facilitate an appreciation and an understanding of others. Theory of mind is one part of this, describing our capacity to comprehend that people other than ourselves have mental states, that they have beliefs, responses, and emotions that may not be identical to our own. It's what every 3 or 4-year-old is meant to develop at some point. It's a key prerequisite of empathy, and drama, film, photography, museums, and music have all been shown in studies to facilitate empathy, as has literature. An experiment by psychologists in the United States concluded that reading literary fiction, as opposed to non-fiction, popular fiction, or nothing at all, led to better performance on tests of theory of mind. I could give many more examples, such as the Readers' Organisation, whose work across Great Britain with vulnerable people who have little experience of literature, helping them to read classic novels aloud to each other in small groups, enabling them to reflect openly on their experience and think about their own identity, prompted in typical literary fashion by a word or a phrase. All my examples suggest a capacity of cultural engagement to help generate both reflection and empathy. And a key dimension of this is what we call aesthetic distance. That what I'm seeing is not real, but it feels like reality, which helps consideration of difficult dimensions of one's own life and that of others. A related component considers how art and culture help produce engaged citizens. Many studies, particularly in the US, testify to its association with civic behaviours, such as voting, joining civil society organisations, volunteering. But it's also about more than that, helping articulate a broader and often critical political imagination. Climate change is one of those challenges. We organised a workshop for arts organisations working with communities to think about climate change. The workshop concluded that if art was used not didactically to teach, but rather as a stimulus for reflection and debate, it could influence people's attitudes and their willingness to change their behaviours. An issue that came up repeatedly in that workshop was how the oblique process of cultural engagement helped people believe that they had genuine options and choices, something that authoritative pronouncements about climate change can all too often shut down. It made people feel empowered. Graffiti, a powerful contemporary art form that is ephemeral in a way increasingly present in public culture, often voices political and social criticism. And one other example, let me also cite how arts and culture have been used extensively to bring together as citizens people living in societies traumatised by war, in the Balkans, Northern Ireland, and elsewhere. Often by civil war, where civilians are not accidental victims but targeted by combatants. In that post-conflict setting, the aesthetic distance offered by cultural activity can provide ways of healing and overcoming trauma in and between communities. Often within a community, between them. Caboche's striking work in Belfast takes challenging theatre productions into Protestant and Catholic communities separately, believing that until people come to terms with their own role in past conflict, they will be unable to heal their relationship with others. I should observe, however, that before we proclaim too loudly the beneficial impact of culture after conflict, we must remember that culture was itself often fundamental in driving the very civil conflicts whose damage it is being called upon to repair. Examples such as these point to something very fundamental about the relationship of arts and culture to political engagement and citizenship. Cultural engagement helps translate abstract ideas into narratives on a human scale, and in the open and non-didactic fashion that the arts allows. It also works obliquely, forcing us to reimagine and disturbing complacency. In this respect, whether we're talking about climate change, public art and civic action, young people's oppositional movements using graffiti, or dealing with the consequences of conflict, it underlines the capacity of arts and culture to articulate alternatives to current assumptions, to fuel a broader political imagination that is essential to all democratic societies. Let me turn more briefly now to some of the other components of cultural value, where the claims made have often looked for value in the wrong place, often places where simple numbers could be found and presented as evidence. With respect to the economy, we must look beyond economic impact. where methodologies and results are open to serious criticism, and concentrate instead on other benefits. These might include the way a vibrant cultural environment supports the commercial creative industries, though advocates, including Arts Council England in my own country, all too often assume a connection between the cultural sector and the creative industries without asking how that relationship works or testing it with evidence. Another example would see arts and culture as part of a broader innovation system, shaping a population that is challenging and creative for the wider economy, as well as generating spillover processes that link art and culture, the creative industries, and other parts of the economy. Or there's the part played by a cultural environment in attracting talent and investment to a country and above all to a city. These all seem to me much more important for the economy than our economic impact assessments. And importantly, they're all much more rooted in the distinctiveness of arts and culture and what it does. A broader vision is similarly needed for cities, where too much attention has been given to regeneration through new infrastructural investment in concert halls or galleries, or through the encouragement of new creative and cultural quarters. Culture-led urban regeneration is usually accompanied by gentrification, as a community's residents are progressively replaced by those from more prosperous backgrounds attracted by the creative and lively atmosphere. Urban regeneration through culture is frequently accompanied by the rise of the experience economy, where outsiders come for the buzz, the cafes, and the shopping. I was in the Distillery Quarter yesterday and can confirm that. A corollary of all of this is the disruption and exclusion of communities, as those who live there, and in creative quarters also those who produce there, are forced out by rising property values. Hoxton in East London is a well-known example. A rundown 19th century workshop area became celebrated in the 1990s as a centre for young artists and musicians. By the time it had become a symbol of creative Britain, and Tony Blair made a personal visit in 1999, I think it was, at that moment it had peaked. And with rents rising as property developers leveraged the cultural assets, artists moved out and restaurants and galleries transformed Hoxton into a destination for visitors. In a parallel way, major cultural-led regeneration projects, whether new infrastructure or creative quarters, may improve a place, but they rarely improve a community. A comparison of major cultural regeneration programs in Montreal, Sydney, and Milan concluded that the key needs are to engage local communities and to invest not just in hardware, but in software, the small-scale ways in which local people can engage with the redevelopment process. This is rarely done, and community suffers. Incidentally, last year, I was asked by the Global Cultural Districts Network, of which Harbourfront Centre here in Toronto is a member, to write a report for them on the social impact of cultural districts. My report, which is now available from the GCDN website, my report proposed a typology of social impacts and called upon the 40 or so network members to be clearer about their social objectives and to commit a stronger evaluation of their progress, and to commit to stronger evaluation of their progress in achieving those objectives. Now, the outcome of culture-led urban regeneration has often been to increase inequality within the overall urban space, with property prices the key driver. In the words of Klaus Kunzmann, each story of regeneration begins with poetry and ends with real estate. The urban benefits of arts and culture and of the creative industries are not illusory, but they accrue within a process of continuing displacement as districts change their character. Might a different kind of cultural presence impact more positively on neighbourhoods? The social impact of the Arts Project at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia explores the ecology of different cultural resources, non-profits, creative businesses, artists, participants within low-income neighbourhoods, and how this is associated with social characteristics such as welfare outcomes, crime, school attendance, population stability. In poorer neighbourhoods of Philadelphia, and most recently in their work on New York, they find that a high level of cultural assets is associated with lower levels of social stress than in similar neighbourhoods with low cultural assets. Their work suggests a more balanced and organic path to regeneration. Arts and culture do appear to bring benefits to cities and to urban life, but in the context of structured urban inequality, we need far more clarity about what those benefits are and how they are achieved. Sorry, yes, that's correct. When it comes to the benefits of arts and culture for health, there's a tendency in Britain for government to ask about short-term financial savings from clinical arts therapies. And striking as these are, they will not themselves yield savings or other benefits on the scale needed to demonstrate the importance of the arts to health. It's a reminder of the tendency to seek hard and, if possible, financial numbers when the issues are far too complex for those numbers to be meaningful. We need to focus, for example, on the way arts engagement, everyday arts engagement, can sustain good mental health, as well as help deal with mental illness, an issue being explored by the March Network in the UK, on which I'm a co-investigator, looking at the way cultural and community assets support mental health. We should also be highlighting the use of art and design to produce better healthcare environments where both patients and staff feel a greater sense of ownership and empowerment, and the benefits of cultural engagement for people as they get older, and the demonstrable benefits it brings to those living with a dementia and those who care for them. What is known for art on prescription sees doctors refer people for arts activities to address the medical problems that they present. Most of all of I've been talking about still concentrates on short to medium term interventions, rather than on the longer term health benefits associated with cultural engagement. And I've been struck by the way most of those engaging with the March Network are involved in focused short-term mental health interventions, and how few of those who've engaged address the long-term mental health benefit of cultural engagement by those not presenting mental health problems. Since the early days of the Cultural Value Project, I've been fascinated by cohort studies of health in Finland and in Sweden, which show an association between long-term arts engagement and positive health outcomes over periods of 15 to 20 years or more. People who were active attenders and participants had much better health outcomes than those who were not. It's because they were all better off and better educated, you say. No. This was true after controlling for social, economic and demographic variables such as income, education, occupation, and other lifestyle factors. A part of me was with those who say there must be some confounding variable that we're missing. But innovative epidemiological work for the UK by Daisy Fancourt at UCL in London is providing a degree of confirmation. We need to know a lot more about this and to make more of it. Turning to arts education in schools, it's regularly claimed in Britain to improve attainment in standardised tests taken at regular intervals by school pupils. Such tests have become a way to capture attainment through schooling in both Britain and the US, although the attainment measured is of a very, very narrow kind. Evidence on the association between arts education and the results of standardised attainment tests is actually unconvincing, with most improvement as a result of arts education or associated with arts education marginal at best. But why are narrow standardised attainment tests the measure? Because they're a poor indicator of the breadth of benefits that arts education brings. There's extensive evidence of its impact on the factors that support learning and that are improved by arts education. Factors such as confidence, motivation, cognitive abilities, problem solving, and of course the imagination and questioning that are fundamental to both wider learning and the needs of citizens and the workforce in the future. But improvement in standardised attainment itself is not confirmed by most of the research studies. Once again, advocates for the arts seem to have been looking in the wrong place. And they've done so because they've accepted the measures they believe governments want to hear. And by the way, even if it were true, as is often claimed in Britain at least, that studying music makes you better at maths, why don't we ask whether studying maths makes you better at music? Why do we accept this hierarchy of disciplines? Both are important. As I've ranged across the various ways arts and cultural engagement may produce benefits to individuals and society, one issue has kept coming up, that simple quantitative indicators can limit and distort our understanding. Quantitative methods are important where they provide meaningful evidence, but are not in themselves more rigorous or more appropriate than other forms of evidence. And that's why my fourth question is so important. By what methods should we find and evidence the value of arts and culture? Only if we start with my first three questions can we see how context and purpose determine the character of our investigation. Only then can we see the complexity of the variables involved, and only then can we see why we must capture the personal dimension of engagement. Only then can we know whether we're asking the right questions and whether we're using the right methods to answer them. The search for measurable indicators of value comes from wishing to start with what can be counted, rather than to ask what we're interested in and how best to find evidence for it. And here lies the attraction of using simple numerical indicators. The success of art in prisons is tested by reoffending rates. Effects on the economy are tested through economic impact studies. Arts education in schools by narrow standardized tests, when the real benefits in all these areas are known to be so much more complex and indeed so much more interesting. These quantitative indicators are often no more than inadequate proxies for something more complex, but they're used because they seem more straightforward. So a key question that must be asked when choosing evaluation methods concerns objectives. Are we seeking large-scale data on cultural impact, methods that are scalable and results that offer comparability? Or do we want in-depth understanding of outcomes? It's the difference between breadth and depth, and each offers different benefits and may require different methods. If we're trying to capture the wider impact of culture, we must be open to a much broader range of evaluation methods and evidence. We must also question the hierarchy of evidence and methodologies that dictates how research informs public policy. This hierarchy privileges quantitative data, the experimental method, and randomized controlled trials. Understanding the difference an arts and culture engagement makes to individuals and society may involve showing a causal link. But linear models of cause and effect can only be found in very precise situations to answer very precise questions. Most research on arts and culture can only show an association between variables rather than a linear causal relationship. Yet the experimental method and randomized controlled trial are regarded as the gold standard for evidence in areas for which they were simply not devised. Cultural experience happens in real-life contexts, with their effects subject to a great many confounding factors, meaning that variables can rarely be isolated in the way required by a genuine experiment. Other approaches, not least those from the humanities and the qualitative social sciences, must be seen as equally valid if we're to make progress in research and evaluation. We need to recognize the rigor and the relevance of qualitative approaches, such as those drawn from ethnography, history, literary, or arts-based methods. They'll often require case studies where focused narratives draw on qualitative and often phenomenological evidence. Arts and humanities approaches allow us to analyze meanings and representations, historical parallels and experiences, and above all, it allows the close reading of texts, language, images, and performance. Without all of these and more, a great deal will not be understood. This is how we can capture benefits, such as reflectiveness and empathy, citizenship, community cohesion, mental health, educational motivation, desistance from offending, urban attractiveness, creativity, and so much else. Methodological rigor is just as present in the arts and humanities as in the sciences, but it's a different rigorous approach, better suited to the complexity, both the activities and the responses that characterize culture, and it will often combine qualitative and quantitative evidence. Indeed, quantitative and qualitative evidence can yield different knowledge. I was told by a researcher working on art in a prison that inmates involved in an arts program had a higher rate of disciplinary offences in the prison than those who'd not been involved. Asked for their comments, prison officers said those inmates argued more because they were changing as people. They were becoming more confident and more questioning, less willing to accept authority in a simplistic way. They were judged by the prison officers themselves to be changing for the better. Another example is English National Ballet's dance project for people with Parkinson's disease. Artistically driven sessions use live music, dance, rhythm, voice, and creative expression. An evaluation did not find significant improvement on standard clinical scales and biomechanical measures. But interviews with the dancers and with their families watching them identified improvements in areas such as fluency, balance, and gait that didn't show up in the standard tests. It was in non-motor areas not conventionally tested that real improvement was visible. In each of these examples that I've given you, which is correct, the quantitative or the qualitative evidence? The answer is surely both. They don't give us data that can be combined, aggregated, but incommensurable knowledge, all of which we need. And in this respect, I was struck by the evaluation of the Arts Beyond Bars project for its funder, Art Place America. The People's Paper Co-op in Philadelphia, PPC, used art and paperwork with ex-prisoners seeking to have their convictions expunged. The evaluation report says much that is positive about the work of the PPC. For example, and I quote, participant interviewees emphasized that by building a cohort of women returning from incarceration and working with others to transform re-entry services, PPC builds community and develops the community's capacity and social capital. End of quote. It makes many such positive statements, but nowhere does it analyze the huge body of documents, responses from open-ended surveys, artwork in community spaces, photographs, and so on, generated by PPC to support its conclusions. Instead, its conclusion is this. This large volume of records can support a detailed qualitative assessment of PPC's progress. But to estimate the programme's broader outcomes and effects, quantitative performance metrics would be needed. To which I have to ask, why, given the richness of the evidence already available? We need to value arts and humanities approaches, such as those in research funded through the Cultural Value Project. Let me run through some of these very quickly. The Reader organisation, to which I've already referred, brings together in small groups people who have had lives damaged by abuse, homelessness, addiction, and mental illness. By reading aloud to each other from works of literature, people with little background in reading started talking about their own lives and experiences. This is researched by careful reading and rereading of exact transcripts of the discussions, literal, word-for-word transcripts of the discussions, using approaches from literary analysis and linguistics to interpret what was happening. In another project, focus groups explored how people valued public art in the English coastal town of Ilfracombe. One work was Damien Hirst's Verity, and the other was Alex Hartley's Nowhere Island, a piece of land. This is Verity, you see on the slide. Nowhere Island was a piece of land revealed by a retreating glacier in the Norwegian high Arctic and mounted on a raft by the artist and pulled all the way to the coast of the United Kingdom. It was proclaimed a new nation and towed around the southwest coast of England with its visit to a town preceded by a public programme organised by its land-based embassy, where people signed up as citizens and debated its constitution together. The focus groups exploring the impact of these very different works of public art use images in a visual matrix to provide non-verbal stimulus for different types of discussion than they would otherwise have had. Or, a Grand Elders dance group for older people in Gateshead in northeast England was shown by ethnographic research to help the participants reflect about themselves and their identity. And a final example, and it was ethnographic research that did that. A final example took a war memorial to those of the Sikh religion and of South Asian origin who had died fighting for Britain in the Second World War. Through historical and literary analysis, it explored the different layers of meaning and value attached to the memorial by those who participated in the annual ceremonies, uncovering the relationships between history, heritage, and identity as it emerged within and between different generations of Sikhs. Now, none of these understandings could have been achieved without arts and humanities methods, too rarely used in the evaluation of cultural engagement, nor can they have been researched other than through precise case studies. We must not dismiss the case study on the grounds that it is not representative. Rigorous case studies create understandings that escape a large-scale trawl for data. I'm not decrying the approaches of science or quantitative social science. There is no hierarchy, and one approach should not be privileged over others. Nor am I decrying the use of econometric methods to capture value through willingness to pay and subjective well-being approaches on which the Cultural Value Project funded important work. No, what matters is that the methods are appropriate for the understanding being sought. Indeed, if we're looking for the impact of specific cultural organisations, initiatives or programmes, we often need multi-criteria work that gathers together findings on a variety of dimensions, capturing different kinds of value and setting them out in a multi-criteria model. One such device well known in business is the balanced scorecard. which brings together different criteria without losing their separate meanings, presenting qualitative and quantitative results in a report that allows us to balance the different outcomes. Or social return on investment is another multi-criteria approach, one increasingly used by cultural and third sector organisations, though I don't know how much presence it has in Canada. SROI has impressive features. It involves stakeholders in defining the objectives, and it gives weight to non-financial outcomes. But it then loses the rich knowledge by requiring a single numerical result, X dollars of social value for every $1 of cost, which means it needs financial proxy values for outcomes such as confidence, resilience, reflectiveness, or social capital. And most of those proxy values look purely inventions. This is surely unnecessary. The great benefit of multi-criteria evaluation is that it allows us to report on the outcomes for different criteria. Indeed, we often confuse debate about evaluation methods with debate about reporting methods. The leaner and more precise the reporting on outcomes, the more objective it is thought to be. We should instead report on a range of outcomes associated with different criteria for value and allow the judgment of those receiving the report to re-enter the evaluation process. Have we abandoned the use of judgment, of human judgment, in the face of too narrow indicators? Before drawing to a conclusion, let me add one further plea, that we recognise the need for a longitudinal perspective in work on the impact of arts and culture. And I'm saying that not just because I'm a historian. Most evaluation is very short-term. As far as personal engagement is concerned, the information captured is often immediate as people emerge from an event. The big question about personal experience is, does it last? Or does it need regular topping up to have the effects claimed? And if it lasts, how long does it last? I've already referred to the evidence showing the long-term health benefits associated with cultural engagement. Let me just mention two other examples of why time matters. In a study for the Cultural Value Project, theatre audiences in 3 towns were asked to respond to surveys after performance of plays. One survey as they came out, and the other survey 2 months later. What people said about their experiences changed over time. Immediately after the performance, people talked about affect, feelings, in which sensory aspects, such as the production and performance, dominated their responses. By contrast, when surveyed 2 months later, and of course a smaller number of people responded 2 months later, but when surveyed 2 months later, there was a greater focus on the cognitive, because by now respondents were primarily reflecting on the themes and ideas in the play they'd seen. Surveying only as people emerged from a cultural event would have missed this evolution of impacts. And secondly, a thorough analysis of the evaluation of European capitals of culture, a survey carried out by Beatrice Garcia at the University of Liverpool, concluded that each city was shown to have benefited substantially from the activities and investment in its year as European Capital of Culture. It was, after all, the transforming impact of being European Capital of Culture that had dominated their bids for the title. Yet few evaluations continued more than a few months after the year had ended, and even fewer had established good baseline data prior to that year. Only through longitudinal analysis over several years can we know whether they succeeded in their objectives. And Garcia concluded that without political will or finance to carry it out, longitudinal analysis was rare indeed, so really, we didn't know if they'd been successful. Let me conclude. My title implies that we aren't very good at talking about the impact and value of arts and culture, and I've laid out some of the reasons for that. Above all, the problem lies in our failure to address my first 3 questions with clarity. And as far as my 4th question is concerned, an acceptance of existing assumptions about evidence and methods. There is no single measure, but a range of experiences and benefits to individuals and society that we must try to capture. Let's abandon the belief that a continuing refining of indicators will give us good answers. If we want to understand what is going on in arts and cultural engagement and the value that derives from it, then we must use diverse methods and diverse kinds of evidence, including those that give access to personal experience, because what we're mostly exploring is complex interventions and complex experiences in a complex world, and that's why the 4 questions that shape my talk are so important. 3 final thoughts. First, by showing what art does and its various outcomes, I'm not arguing or even accepting that enabling other benefits is its primary purpose. That is why I hesitate over the word impact. Rather, looking at the arts in this way shows us what art does through looking beyond the art itself. Privileging personal experience and looking at the process, not just the result of arts engagement, underlines that. The second thought is the thorny question of quality. And it's one we're often faced with. Does art have to be good to achieve its outcomes? The issue of aesthetic value is a real one, though we're increasingly aware today of how concepts of quality and excellence are contested concepts. Even if we could agree on measures of each, I doubt that we'd find a simple correlation between quality and impact. It's probable that the aesthetic quality of the art in singing for health programs is not of critical importance. Though remember that without aesthetic satisfaction, people are unlikely to keep returning and carry on singing. But when it comes to reflection and empathy, for example, we've all been to plays where we wanted to think about the issues raised, but where the artistic quality was too didactic and too simplistic to help us to do so. And when it comes to practice by non-professionals, amateur practice, in music or dance or pottery, it's the aspiration and the effort that delivers much of the benefit, rather than the simple quality. As has rightly been said, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. That was G.K. Chesterton. He wasn't about this, but I think works beautifully for a lot of amateur art, so long as you're trying to do it well. If you're not actually succeeding, it doesn't matter. My very final thought. In our work to understand and value culture and its impact, we must remember my first question. Why do we want to know? The answer cannot be primarily to set targets that can then be audited. Rather, it's to understand, to evidence, and to report for a wide variety of purposes. I say this because one of the dangers inherent in sophisticated measures of impact is that they then become the target to be achieved by an organization, or by a cultural initiative, or by a cultural investment. And as Goodhart's law many years ago has it, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Once our sophisticated measures are turned into KPIs, we'll have threatened the risk and uncertainty that are at the heart of cultural practice, cultural experience, and yes, cultural value. We'll have destroyed the point of arts and cultural engagement. And this is the case whether we're thinking of a large theatre company, a live music venue, or a community arts organisation. We'll have destroyed the point of arts and culture, which thrives by taking risks. It's in creating spaces for the unexpected, a myriad of ways to tease apart certainties and create space for change, that culture is so essential to our societies, our economies, our politics, and our lives. Our report was written before the rise in my country, in the United States and elsewhere, of a new popular politics resting on slogans and certainties rather than questions and reflection. But the capacity of the arts to engender nuance and questioning is surely even more needed today. And we need to make much more of that when we talk about the impact of the arts. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'm Sarah Diamond, by the way, OCADU University. You certainly did not disappoint. I think our back-of-the-bus conspiracy really paid off in terms of both intrinsic and instrumental value. So I just wanted to thank you so much and say that, you know, in this time of reductionist evaluation, and for those of us in the university sector in this province, we're living through this as well. And for those of us who also do believe in the value of quantitative, it's incredibly important to be reminded that, the humanities have an incredibly important role in terms of knowledge, and that this mix of qualitative and quantitative understandings is really how we must be able to proceed. Thank you for the generosity of inclusion, for your ability to remind us that boundaries are malleable, that we really must take into account a complexity of cultural practices, And interestingly, the Culture Track report, which Business for the Arts and a number of organizations supported, showed exactly the same, that the way that people who participate in culture in this country understand themselves and their practices is across these very, very broad spectrums. And as you ended, in a time of conflict and political transitions, it's so important to be reminded of the importance of reflective individuals, the ability to imagine futures, to manage ambiguity, to be able to have vigorous forms of evaluation, but really to make our practices better. Really, to make culture better and more meaningful for more people, and to really manage to step away from reductionism. So thank you so much.